So I'm standing in Isabella Hill's rest area, which is right in the middle of Erskineville. And it's hard to tell in contemporary times, but Erskineville is actually on the side of a hill. Starts in Newtown on King Street, where we started the tour, is a high ridge about 40 meters above sea level. And gradually we have a downhill slope through Erskineville, eventually going down, reaching to the neighboring suburb of Alexandria, which is about 4 meters above sea level. Pre-invasion, the landscape was probably quite forested, and there was a big lagoon on the side of the hill about where Erskineville Public School is now. They used to gradually drain down into Shees Creek, or what's known as Alexandria Canal, and then flow out to the Cooks's River. This landscape, however, went through some pretty brutal and fundamental changes in the 1800s. Initially in the early 1800s, we have this land divvied up to clone-less for farmland. And so this land was cleared and different farms were established in big kind of leases of households kind of taking over space. And you know, particularly dairy farming was a big industry out here. We then have, from about the 1850s onwards, the brick-making industry. So we have the brick makers coming out here, taking lots on these segments off these farmlands and digging these big pits and holes in the ground. So we start to get this pockmarked terrain of brick pits all across Erskineville, Newtown and Alexandria. We then have, finally, in the 1880s and 1890s, the kind of creation of an urban area. So McDonaldtown was declared in 1870 an urban area and was later renamed Erskineville in 1890. And we really have most of the houses built here in the 1880s and 1890s. And with that, we have, buildings, we have roads, we have a changing landscape. And so what ultimately we had in the late 1800s was a mixture of these three new brutal landscapes. There was still some farmland and cows around. There were still many holes in the ground causing issues. And then there was also these new streets and these new people coming in to live. However, the issue was that rain still fell on Erskineville, and it still fell and kind of got affected by gravity, but also got affected by the new landscape. And what that ultimately caused was a whole range of different issues in terms of where this water would end up. And so there's this 1884 article by the Evening Standard that kind of really discusses the issue of Erskineville, its kind of topography in terms of its landscape, and the issues of dealing with water that I'm going to read from. And so the article, quite succinctly notes, at the junction of Harold Street and Union Street in McDonaldtown, which is right here, down the back there is the junction, there is a large waterhole, which at present time is filled with dead dogs and cats, all floating in the water. Newtown, being on the ridge, pours its filth into McDonaldtown. Newtown, this time, is at fault. So this kind of very vivid picture of kind of dealing with water in this area in many ways. And indeed, the Evening Standard ran a whole series of articles on McDonaldtown, which is now known as Erskineville, and its kind of issues of the water holes in different ways. And indeed, in one article, they supplied this kind of on-foot narrative of walking through McDonaldtown, where they kind of narrate what is going on in the suburb. And what is quite striking in this narrative is they do not discuss the people of McDonaldtown or Erskineville. They do not discuss the shops or the architecture. They mainly talk about water. And so I'm going to read this at length because it gives a very kind of striking image. And really, where they're walking in this article is they start in Newtown, just up here, and they kind of walk past this area and down this way. So we kind of get their description in detail in this. And it was published, I think, in the 1890s, this article. So they start. We cross something in the shape of a culvert, although ingress and egress are scarcely distinguishable, though which much of a butcher stop and other sewerage from Newtown finds its way. We see here a receptacle, broad, wide and deep. Whether it is cream that flows from or more diluted potion therefore was not assertable, but of a certainty that which we did see flowing through the builders' yards and other premises, meeting with all kindred spirits en route, was far from prepossessing. The man that builds near this purloin of filth should be indicted for an intent to kill. So they're basically talking about all of these filth and mixtures of water kind of flowing in and coming together, around this spot. They continue. We go in a little further and we see a footpath made, which acts as a nice little dam to the sewage of many dwellings. The liquid is, with all possible tractability, being lodged and solidified in the middle of a street in embryo. It would be a waste of energy for the rainbow to reflect its rays on the deposit, for the colours are already there. And we get still further eastward, the scene does not improve, for the drain hole after drain hole, large and small, are laden with what even a child of 4 years seems to be ashamed. We traced the stream of sewage by devious course right away upward through fields, under dwellings, through backyards, close by the sides of bedrooms, under unsightly culverts erected across the street, right away through the northern division of the municipality. The feeders are neither few nor far between, and the loos of curbing and channeling more objectionable in appearance is the pools and streams of house drainage. To particularize every stink or what might be considered a plague spot would be the work which must be left to the inspector of nuisances, if such an officer exists. So we can really see this kind of vivid picture, painted in kind of the 1880s of this area and of this water in different ways. So that previous article by the Evening Standard was written in 1882, and its main rival newspaper, the Sydney Morning Herald, would release an article 2 years later focusing on the same area, and they would name it a Typhoid Valley in Sydney. And they drew a map of this Typhoid Valley, and we are standing right in the middle of it, where they describe the similar stream of refuse coming through. And so once again, I'm going to read from another newspaper in detail that kind of maps out the state of this area and why it was named Typhoid Valley. So it starts, Newtown and McDonaldtown meet in this valley of humiliation and do their best to follow nature by sending down thither all rubbish, and all in this case comprehends a very great deal. A small, vile stream of putrid water passes under WCs, so outdoor toilets, at the back and flows along the streets till it finally takes a downhill course to the bottom of the valley. So basically the water stream is running right past us now, this putrid stream. The issues of typhoid and pollution in Newtown and McDonaldtown become such a big issue that in 1889, the government ordered an investigation into this issue of typhoid in the area, and a final report was released. And the title of the report, and it's quite a mouthful, is Report to the Honourable the Minister of Public Works upon an outbreak of typhoid fever in the municipalities of Newtown and McDonaldtown, with description of the cause and modes and spread of this disease suggests for its prevention. And so the authors came in, and it was 1889, and they did this study about why there were so many deaths to typhoid within this area. And they came to the conclusion at their report, we regret there are no means of asserting how many valuable lives have been swallowed up during it to the past few years. And in particular here, Harold Street and Union Street, these houses here, almost all the families passed away within those houses. And what's quite striking in this report is they managed to interview someone called C. Hornsby Spear, who was a clerk of Holy Orders here, who was able to give them insights about the why of the Typhoid Valley and why so many families were dying. And so they go on to quote Spear in detail, which I will read out. So Harold Street, which is this street here, Harold Street and others are built upon the sites of old clay pits, on old brick pits. These, which were extended far on each side to the east and west, and there's a map in the report which I'll show, have been filled with earth and garbage during past years. A large cavity thus exists which is undrained and imperfectly ventilated, and which apparently always carries stinking water and mud. So saying basically these pits that were in the ground all along here were kind of filled up with rubbish, and then houses put on top. There is nothing between the rooms of the houses and this damp and filthy cavity but the ordinary joists and floorboards. So it was kind of coming up through the floorboards, and that was causing all these families here to become sick. They go on to say, in Harold Street and other places, I have seen these old brick holes filled up with sweeping of gutters, the refuse of backyards, reeking with vegetable and animal matter in the highest state of putrefaction, emitting odours which would have thrown the 36 stenches of Cologne into shame. And vile deposits were sold to the owners of the land by the local government of Newtown at 6p a load, and deposited on these lands by the government carts. So the people filling up this area was the local government, kind of buying it off the waste disposals and solving the waste issue by putting in these holes and covering it with soil. So what we can really see in this scenario is kind of the connections between the landlords, the local politicians, and the old brick pit history and how it gets solved. And so a lot of the old brick masters that made these holes were now these landlords. They were also the politicians in power. And so they were working together to buy and solve the rubbish waste off the council, or off rubbish makers for the council, and putting in these holes. They were then just putting a thin layer of soil on top, and then on top of that they were building these houses for profit. And indeed, and there's a really kind of vivid example in this report of how they were working together. So Hornsby Spear recommended for one tenant to kind of take the owners of his place to court. And he was living on Union Street, this street just up here. And so he quotes in the report, It was somewhere hereabouts that Mr. Churchwood of Union Street prosecuted the owner of the land, who was Mr. Pete James, a wealthy resident of McDonaldtown, at my suggestion, for filling up old brick holes with foul and filthy sweepings from the gutters, backyards of the borough of Newtown, which was sold to him by that corporation, the local government, at 6p a load. When the case came before the magistrate at Newtown, both the mayor of Newtown and the mayor of McDonaldtown appeared in the court on behalf of the defendant. The magistrate then snubbed an important witness and the case was dismissed. So what we really see is a massive political power, the mayors lobbying on side of the landlords and not solving this issue. And so this is why when we think about that Typhoid Valley story, about that water fountain where the mayor and the aldermen and the local member of parliament are creating water to solve the issue of people getting sick from typhoid, if we actually peel back this layer a bit more, we see they're actually directly involved in profiting from speculative real estate, profiting from filling up holes with waste, and creating the Typhoid Valley in itself. So in effect, they're pretending to solve a problem that they've been involved in constructing themselves.